This is A State of Control, the monthly look at the control and automation space of the AV industry. My name is Tim Albright. I'm your host. With us, as always, his name is Steve Greenblatt. He's the chief everything at Control Concepts. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Great to be back. Another great episode today.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see if it's fair. It has potential. How about that? Also with us is Dave Goldberg, affectionately known as Goldie. How are you, sir?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
Very good.
I'm going to try to do my best to make sure Steve's thing doesn't come true.
Steve's thing doesn't come true.
That it's going to be a good episode?
You just assumed it was going to be a good episode.
Well, he did, and I apologize for that in advance. So, and Goldie's with our buddies over at Advanced AV, which is also where Mr. John Green is from. So, and my favorite marketing and PR person, Marina. So, also with us is Mr. Bernard Morgan. Bernard, how are you, sir?
Doing great. How about you guys?
Doing well.
It is Monday, though.
It is Monday. It's Monday. Bernard and I were talking before anybody got here. It's already. I'm putting out fires already early this morning, so it's too early for that stuff. And last but not least, Mr. Jim Maltese. How are you, sir?
Very well. How's it going, guys? Good to be here.
Good. So here's what we're going to do today, and I mentioned the fires I'm already putting out this early on a Monday morning. It's kind of apropos because of what we're going to talk about, and that is troubleshooting, commissioning, rolling up, turning up. However, whatever kind of verbiage that your company uses, we typically use commissioning or turning up a system when we start talking about getting a control system and an AV system to substantial completion and to sign off, honestly. So a couple things before we get started, and as we get started, rather, Steve, when we start talking about testing the system, right, and it depends on what the scope says, and there are certain things that are kind of squishy, and it depends on what the spec is written. But in general, what do we do? What do you do when you test a system?
I think from a programmer standpoint, let's say we're responsible for when the button is pressed to making sure that whatever is supposed to happen happens. And
okay.
Defining what's supposed to happen obviously is important to agree upon from the beginning. But whatever is the cause of something not happening, it ends up being the responsibility of a programmer to at least help to identify where the problem may reside or help to solve the problem, because the fact is that from a control standpoint, you're not controlling something if it's not working. So we take on the responsibility, I believe, of being part of a team and being involved in that process of narrowing down where a problem may lie, even to a point of making doing some basic field testing or maybe helping configure a device, things that touch a control system.
Okay, so this is something that actually we've been talking about at Innovad, and Bernard, I'm going to pull you in on this. So you've tested the system, and there's something that's not working. And Steve kind of alluded to it, where there are certain things that touch a control system. And I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine who works for one of the control manufacturers, and I said, you know what, just because it says product X doesn't mean it's a part of the control system. And that was a whole nother conversation. But as these control companies get into other aspects of AV, so something's not working, Bernard. How do you tell whether or not it's a programming problem?
Well, I think the first thing that I try to do on a job is simply to step back when you get to the site or get ready to commission the site, and just without a laptop, grab a pen and paper, walk through the site, and physically see the environment. Because I think so many times what happens is everybody's so caught up to trying to get the touch screen, the user interface working, we don't take two steps back to look at the environment. And you know what? If there's no power here or this display has problems, no matter how many buttons you press on the touch panel, it's not going to work. So I think the precursor of commissioning the system is truly get a baseline on where the system is at, and taking two steps back and say, okay, what is the environment that we're in, and what does that environment look like? And I think that's kind of what is step one. But we usually everybody jumps to step three and do a step instead of doing step one, which is let's take 2 steps back. Let's look at the environment and see what's there and what is ready to be commissioned.
Jim, from your guys' standpoint, taking what Bernard's saying is making sure that the environment is correct, making sure that, not to be stupid here, but making sure that things have power, making sure that if you're controlling via serial, making sure the DB9 connector is connected, and making sure that it's actually hitting, pins 2, 3, and 5, and whichever one else you need to for that one. What else can we do to make sure that to delineate what's programming and what's not when it comes to making sure a system's working?
Well, I think the biggest moneymaker in terms of generating profits and decreasing the amount of time in the field for commissioning, for troubleshooting, is to have an excellent staging before the system actually ships. And so...
Say that again, please, slowly.
And watch us all applaud.
Yes. But the idea that you can fully test or mock up a system in an integrator's shop, where there's internet, where there's manuals, where there's tools, where if you wanted to take a 6-foot cable and try something out instead of trying to dig out a 200-foot cable run between walls, up ceilings, and in between lights and elevator shafts, stuff like that, will save you so much time. So a lot of people focus on the commissioning, but staging is really where you can have the biggest impact in the end game.
Okay. So, and I'm going to pick on Goldie here in just 1 second. Jim, but back to you and to that, and I'm not kidding, that's a wonderful point, and that's something that probably all of us are trying to get done even on a weekly basis. Part of Infocom's Apex program is that's something they encourage you to do is make sure that you mock up a system, you test a system. How do you do that? I mean, how do you? I guess the best way to ask this is how do you educate the integrator to value that, right? Because let's be honest here, if we don't value something, we're not going to do it. We're not going to
right.
make points for it. How do you get them to see the value in that?
Yeah. Well, so AVR, what we do mostly for a living is third-party testing and verification. And so clients will hire us to make sure these milestones are in place. And we used to go around kind of evangelizing this whole process and doing an adequate design review, doing staging, doing commissioning. Those key milestones are imperative to having a successful project. But whether we were talking to the wrong people or we weren't using the right language, it never really stuck with the integrators. So what we've done is made it a product and sold it to the end users. And the end users who have been burned, who have had installations be at 90% complete for months and months and months, they never see an end date in sight. Those are the perfect people to go in and say, you know what, why don't you put these milestones in your RFP? And so if the end users are doing it, if the people who are paying for the systems insist on you have to do a complete staging before it's shipped to the field, it's going to happen.
Yeah. All right, Goldie, from a full-on integrator programmer relationship here, do you guys? I mean, I shouldn't say that, but is that something that you guys have found to be beneficial? Is staging this and getting things ready, and instead of kind of instead of ready, shoot, aim, or ready, aim, shoot, what have you, have you found that beneficial in getting the program ready to go and testing it in your shop?
Absolutely. No doubt about it that staging, or mock-up, as I used to call it, and I used to get picked on about it, is a hugely important part of the process. It just seems like because of accelerated schedules and because some contractor was late with something or other and because you're trying to squeeze 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag, that sometimes the staging just doesn't happen. But everybody knows that you always want it to happen if possible. And obviously from an integrator standpoint, I guess you guys have a different, if you don't get it done, if I don't get it done, I go, oh well, my manager screwed it up. If you guys don't get it done, it's like a whole different, you need to move on to the next project, and the next project may have nothing to do with the particular customer that you're not going to make it on time for now because they didn't have a staging.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation, right? I mean, you've got we kind of talking about this off the air. We this has been the summer of construction delays. I don't know what it is, at least here in St. Louis, and it's been not just one client, not two clients. There have been several clients throughout the Midwest where it's been for whatever reason. I don't know if it's been a very wet summer here in the Midwest, so that's possible. But you do have schedule, and you do have to make sure that you meet contracts, right? You try to make sure that the contracts are fulfilled, but you also have to make sure that there's not this domino effect, and some of that's scheduling, and some of that's project management. So, Steve, when it comes to troubleshooting and it comes to let's identify what's programming and what's not, and we've kind of already gone through this, but when we troubleshoot and we figure out it is a programming or it's not a programming problem, what's the best way to communicate that it's not programming, that it's something else?
It doesn't work by saying it's your damn wiring.
Well, it might with some, yes.
Well, I think what it comes down to is that you have to be. You need to be confident in your work, and you need to have tested your work prior to arriving, and have a degree of knowledge in saying that I know that I know that I'm good up to this point. If you're just throwing something together and you don't have confidence in your program, all bets are off. And I'm not saying that programmers don't make mistakes, and I'm not saying that it couldn't be a programming issue, but many times you're able to test to a point of saying that I know that I'm at least sending out this command, why this command is not doing what I expect it to do, or why a switch isn't happening, or why we're not seeing an image. Those are things that we have to start to go down the line, and I think troubleshooting is a real important part of our business, and it's an art, and it's something that some people struggle with. You have to narrow down the variables, and you can't start changing a bunch of things. You have to be systematic about it, and you have to be able to prove out your system and narrow down. And it's kind of like finding the target and rule out all the possibilities, and hopefully you can get it down to one or two things. And I think it's important to be able to have a comfort level with a technician, trust level, and knowing that they're working alongside of you, and they're doing their part, and they have confidence in the work that they've done, but are also willing to try things and willing to work alongside of you to come up with a solution, or at least come up with what could be a cause of the problem.
All right, let's take the opposite side. Well, not the opposite side, but an integrator side. Goldie, from your standpoint, what would be the best way for you to receive that information? And don't say you're damn wiring either.
Well, a lot of the jobs that I do are ones that I've done 20 for that customer already, so I know that this code works. And I'm talking from the code guy standpoint. Because generally, when you guys are brought in, I don't interface with you. I do the same type of interfacing with my technicians, and the staging. Obviously, if it worked in staging and it's not working now, then something else is wrong. That's the first thing. I would definitely listen to whatever they have to say about, or I would explain that, hey, look, it worked in staging, or I've used this piece of code 3 bazillion times, so I know this works. We got to look somewhere else. But I never have a problem working with them and kind of talking them through it. And every once in a while, you get one of those guys, one of those technicians who's just like, yeah, I already did that. I already tested that. I already changed out the wire. And they're lying. You know what I mean? So, but at least when I work in the same company with them, then it's easier for me to say, what a jerk, you're lying, than it is for you guys.
Well, and Bernard, that's a good point. So and some of this is kind of, we're talking a little bit like relationship stuff here, but it is, right? It's communication, and it's making sure that we all kind of work on the same playing field.
Well, I think the interesting thing about this is like if you take it, I take a look at back 15 years ago, because today we have one DSP that does the job of 8 different sound pieces that we had in the field 15 years ago. Let's take it back 15 years ago when you used to set up a sound system. You had somebody come in before the front of house engineer or before the person to EQ the room. They would make sure they can pass signal through each one of the individual devices, the amplifier, the compressor, the EQ. And I think now what's happened is the technology's got so advanced, you've taken one box that has replaced 12 boxes, and now you're actually controlling things that you physically can't touch manually.
Yeah.
And a number of the switchers now don't have front panel control. So you get to a point now that's just almost a conundrum that you can't test the physical environment because you have no way of routing the signals beforehand. So I think part of that is up front establishing what your definition of commissioning is, because people today call commissioning something completely different than what we used to call it 10 years ago, because the industry has changed. Yeah. And I think a lot of times when we talk about these projects and we say, hey, we're going to commission a system today, well, before we commission, where are you at and what is your definition of it versus what our definition is? And I think that conversation isn't had a lot, and that's where it causes a lot of confusion in my mind.
Well, and I want to take it a little bit, step back a little further, and Jim, I'll bring you in on this. What's your definition of programming, right? Because here's an interesting conversation that I've had with several different integrators that we do work for. Their definition of programming and my definition of programming sometimes is slightly off. So, Jim, from your standpoint, I'll get the rest of you guys' definitions as well. What is your definition of programming?
Whew. That's a great question. Programming is really in my mind anyway, the integration of the communication of all the devices in the system that need to talk together.
Okay.
And that's figuring out how to make everyone play nicely together, and that's what I would do it. Project-wise, ideally, programming would be, a complete control system specification has been turned over to the client. They signed off on how they want it to look, what they want it to do, and then so programming just becomes delivering that specification.
All right, Mr. Greenblatt, from your standpoint, what is your definition of programming?
I definitely agree with what the way Jim described it. I think it's providing the customization in a system, and it's also being able to bring the equipment to life that doesn't work without having some configuration done by a computer. If we're going to get down to to nuts and bolts, a lot of the boxes that we plug in don't do anything unless they are programmed, and so programming also applies not only to control but also to an audio DSP and even some other devices. So, but if we're talking in the control realm, programming is the instruction set that defines what the system is going to do and how to talk to the different devices.
All right, Bernard, give me your definition of programming.
I guess my definition of programming would be, if we're talking about control systems specifically, unifying different systems to create one unified user experience from a control surface.
Okay.
That would be like the definition of what I would say AV programming is.
All right, I like that. All right, Goldie, from an integrator standpoint, what is programming?
I would say it is generating the original code, obviously, and then kind of following it through, because nobody else can finish off that job without you doing it, basically. The technicians really don't, in my case, our technicians really aren't AMX capable or Crestron capable, and you pretty much need to finish, you got to follow that all the way through. You supply the code, and then hopefully they create a punch list and you can go through it without actually having to go to a job site or something, or you've actually already staged it and and then you help them through to the end till everything works.
All right, let me ask a couple of pointed questions because I'm getting somewhere with this, especially for you, Goldie, because you and Jim both are and I love it. It's the whole staging thing. Who's responsible for firmware? Who's responsible for IP addresses? Who's responsible for the not seemingly simple things, but the get it out of the box, plug it in, make sure there's power, make sure it's not DOA, all that stuff. Is that programming?
In my company, that's technicians.
Okay. Yeah, and that's why I kind of wanted to get that differentiator. That because that's something that we run into, right? You run into it where again, a lot of our clients want us end to end, and if it says Cestron on the front of the box, it's your baby. I don't care what it is. So.
How about the network setup too? Because that's something that's a big gray area right now, and I think that's one of the areas that is causing a lot of tension.
Well, I think it comes also down to this, like I said earlier, about the commissioning a system, defining what everyone's terms are. Because if you start talking about network, IP addresses, and firmware, depending on the size of the system, you could be more. That's not an hour task. You're talking about 10 to 20 hours. So that is definitely a conversation piece to make sure everyone's talking the same language, what their definition of commissioning the system is, because a lot of times, because most companies have one person or the programmer who does all those tasks, they may consider that programming because their programmer does all those tasks. So we're sending the programmer to the job. Well, technically, I would say probably 50% of his time may be programming, debugging. The other 50% is probably commissioning and addressing and standing the system up to be programmed and then to be tested. So I think it comes down to a communication and definition thing.
I think that's great. And to piggyback off Bernard's, it's if you can structure I don't know if it's structuring the relationship or the contract to say, as the programmer, this is the firmware I expect on it, this is the port speeds I expect on it to continue the relationship. I think making clear lines of demarcation could clear up a lot of headaches. And firmware that I wouldn't have thought of that, but how many hours have been blown on the job site where there's no cell reception, no internet? It's huge. That's big. But to maybe even bring it back to some of the troubleshooting stuff, how crazy is it to carry around a either argument killer or troubleshooting kit where maybe you have a 100-foot Cat5 cable, a little tiny router just to get around any networking things, and so when something doesn't work, you take out what other people have supposedly supplied, mock up your own quickly just to prove out, my stuff is working, and then politically keep it self-deprecating. Say, it's a big program. I just want to make sure my stuff is working, so I made up this little network just to make sure my stuff is good, and then just kind of let the chips fall and see people smacking their heads on their own.
Oh, I think you're tricky. Self-deprecating. Wow.
One thing that we do a lot of, if it's a job that we know we're having to do firmware ID and addressing, we'll show up with 2 laptops, one to get our work done and one to do firmware.
Yeah.
Hey, you got to find something. We turn laptops over every year, so you got to find something to do with the old one. But that's a prime example of, going up front of, hey, you know what? I'm going to be doing, 14 devices of firmware on a job. Well, I'm bringing 2 laptops, one so it can do firmware, and one I get some work done. Now, TSA looks at you weird when you try to get through security with 2 laptops. I'll give you that. But
yes, they do.
But that again comes back to, is the commissioning part, is getting the system ready to load a program part of commissioning? Or is commissioning truly the act of testing the system once everything is up and working?
I'm sure you guys see the range of companies that you're working for. I know that when we do it at our company, our technicians are supposed to have all that stuff set up, ready to go, cabling done, firmware upgraded, everything powered and connected, so that the code guy can walk in, as my old boss used to say, white glove, and just hook up and start doing his thing.
Yeah, and I would agree with. I mean, I would that would be my preference, right? I mean, it was. I'm not gonna say which company, which manufacturer it was, but here recently, I had a programmer who spent 3 days running down a problem that had nothing to do with programming, had nothing to do with firmware. There was a problem with the actual product itself. Again, unfortunately, it had the name of the control system, the control company on it, and so since my guy was the one on site, we spent 3 days running down this problem. So, and had it been staged and commissioned, Goldie, he wouldn't have ran into that problem, would he? All right.
Well, and by definition, when a system is commissioned, it means it's fit for use. And so I think a lot of people throw commissioning around when really they're not commissioning; they're finishing the installation. But like heuristically, commissioning is just going through the system once over, and when the system is commissioned, it's 100%, zero defects. Here are the keys. Goodbye, good luck.
I like that definition. Holy cow, that's awesome. I'm going to use that, Jim. Can I use that?
Absolutely.
Do I have to pay you for it?
You could. You don't have to.
All right, never mind. I'll figure something else out. Steve, when it comes to, so what are some of the more common ones that we all run into when it comes to troubleshooting, and some of the more common areas that we, I guess, get caught up in?
Well, dating back to a few years ago, let's say, it was always flipping the pins on a 232 connector. Now things have gotten a little bit more advanced than that, being that we're into the digital age. I think troubleshooting is becoming a little bit more vague. Certainly network communication, we don't have as much at our disposal. Obviously there's less proprietary wiring when you're dealing with the network, but there's also that big cloud there of unknown that comes into play. But of course, making sure that you're communicating with the same protocol on both ends, the same speed. Making sure that we said earlier that the device that you expect to be on the other end is there. When you're talking about a network, being able to test at least that the device address is set and you can communicate with it over the network before you start trying to communicate to it over with a control system. I think you always have to take the control system out of the loop. You have to be able to do manual testing, and I like what was said earlier too, that it used to be the fact that the control system was just an extra layer on an AV system and everything could operate manually. That may not be the case so much anymore, but that was always your fallback. And these days, I think that those lines are a lot more blurred, and there's a lot more dependency on the control system to be operating and to be your front point of control. And I think the ability to do manual testing, it has kind of been lost a little bit, and I know it's there. It's just not as much at your fingertips. So I think, I guess, falling back to being able to do manual testing is pretty key.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about the site for a second, and some of this kind of goes back to what we've been talking about. The underlying thing here, I think the underlying theme is let's get at least as many as possible, tested in the warehouse, make sure that we mock them up. But even at that, you still have to get stuff done on the site. Things have to be ready. Bernard, from your standpoint, what does it mean to be for the site to be ready for you as a programmer?
That definition would be back to if we had the manual front panel controls that we all want to stay around. Basically, all the subsystems and devices on the system are powered up and are functioning. Most of these systems can work standalone, meaning like if you have a display, you can at least turn the display on and select the input. Most of the switchers have a front panel control, so you can manually route inputs to outputs. That's kind of the definition that I would say, is that all the subsystems are stood up, powered up, and communicating within the means they can. and working inside, that means they can.
Okay. Goldie, from your standpoint, what would it mean to you that the site is ready and raring for you to go?
To me, I'm hoping that they already had my code and they already loaded it and they've already taken care of all the firmware and as much of the equipment is there as possible, because even though staging is a great thing, in theory it seems like 90% of the time you can't even get the equipment there that you really want because they already pre-shipped the monitors out to the site or the projectors because they're going to take more installation time. And so therefore you're just stuck with whatever you get out of staging. Whereas once you go to site, I'm hoping everything's really hooked up and ready to go and powered up and, you know, as much working as possible, and that you're just kind of like starting to punch through your list. Your list may be huge, but at least things are up and connected and all those other hurdles are out of the way so that you're not sitting there, like you guys said, waiting hours and hours for firmware to upgrade.
Yeah. Or hours and hours for someone to find the power plug that they misplaced, so you can plug in the projector. Jim, from your standpoint, what does it mean for a site to be ready?
Yeah, so site to be ready, the biggest thing we see is the services not being ready in terms of network ports and TV signal, phones, all that stuff. That's kind of huge, and so all that needs to be in place. The coolest thing I've seen from a programming perspective is, you know, people will forward a test program of sorts that may or may not work. Maybe they have the wrong modules in place or whatnot, but somewhere in that touch panel is, or in the program, is just a system status page where it might not necessarily control anything, but it will provide a graphical representation that this device is communicating with what it expects to, you know, and so it's you know, it can't really do anything for one-way communication, but it can test all your relays. It can make sure it can talk to the mixer, the codec, and everything. It might not control anything, but at least the integrator can see, yeah, you know, I've got that green light there, so my wiring is good. Something's talking to something, and that for a site ready for programming, I think that's a nice little feature to have.
Yeah, absolutely it is. I've seen something similar, but nothing exactly that kind of gives it a graphical interface. That's actually a really good idea. So I'm going to end up writing Jim a check by the end of this show. Steve, and I'm sure he'd be fine with that. Steve, we kind of already touched on this a little bit, but I want to delve into it just a little bit more. Just because something is made by a control manufacturer doesn't necessarily make it a programming job or a programmer's job. Besides that, what are some of the other areas that are kind of debatable, right? Whether or not it's a programmer's job or it's a installer's job.
The big one that's surfacing a lot right now is network setup. It's communication. Why can't I get this device to do what I expect? Why is it not communicating? And I think, of course, the programmer needs to be invested in there, but there's only, I think that there's a gap because we could say we're sending out the right command, we're doing what we expect. Can you check on your side? And they're saying, an installer is saying that my wire is fine, but somebody has to be responsible. And many times it's an installer, or perhaps, and I've started to hear this term of a field engineer, being somebody who configures the other devices that are programmable, whether it's an audio DSP, whether it's a codec or a video wall processor, whatever it might be, something that requires additional setup. And I think that's always a big gray area, is who's responsible for configuring these other devices. And as you mentioned, I think from a programmer perspective, the more things that get labeled that by the name of a control system manufacturer, the more the responsibility is shifted toward, or is presumed to be shifted toward a programmer. But when in fact, though, those devices are still non-control devices, they just have the same brand name.
Yeah, absolutely. Goldie, from your standpoint, what are some of the gray areas you run into?
I would say that the same type of thing as far as we constantly run into the network issues where the customer says, yep, we got it, it's all configured, ready to go. Or like Jim was saying, services aren't ready, there's a POTS line that's supposed to be there and not there, and so we can't test our stuff. But as far as the network goes, our guys are capable, and they usually do have their own bring a switch with them, even if they have to leave it there, just to have the system functioning standalone without even being on the customer's network. Our guys know that that's a tool that we can't commission our system without, and so they come ready to go in case that situation happens, because that situation always happens. But another thing that Steve said was definitions, because somebody else mentioned, one company's definition of some companies are calling them field engineers, other companies call them field techs or whatever. But what it comes down to is, are these guys actually capable of programming? We have our engineering department, and they do all our DSP programming. However, all the techs are all trained too, so that when they go out there and something doesn't work right, they're able to make those changes. They're supposed to be trained to be able to go upload firmware and load code and do all that kind of stuff without a programmer or an engineer actually being there. So I think definitions are really something that I'm guessing on some of the smaller integrators, that your one guy is like a jack of all trades, and so he supposedly does everything, and they're thinking, like you said, when they hire a programmer as a subcontractor, that programmer is going to be the other side of the everything that does the programming.
All right, Jim, let's pull you in on this one. How do we make sure that we're all on the same page and we're all using the same language when it comes to either whether it's Goldie and internally, or it's the external subcontractor programmers?
Yeah, I got nothing on that one. I don't know. I think everyone's going to call it something else, right? But I think per project, the role. So we talked about roles, we talked about lines of demarcation. So if those roles and those lines are defined in the contract between someone, that would be great. But if you want to talk blurring lines, think about all the different customers in a project, right? If an integrator might hire a programmer, but a designer might hire an integrator, and a user might hire an architect who might hire a designer. And so the programmer may do the perfect job of specifying the control systems, showing it to their customer, which is the integrator, and the integrator says, this looks awesome, I'm super happy. But then, the poor programmer is that last guy on the job site, the holding the bag, and now the end user, who's the ultimate client, says, I don't like this layout. Well, you had to go through the architect, to the designer, to the integrator, to the programmer. So all that game of telephone, something happened, and talk about a blurry line. What do you do then? Especially as a programmer, showing off your beautiful control system, and the client says, this is nothing that I asked the architect for.
Yeah.
Sounds like Jim's talking with some first-hand experience.
No, this is hypothetical, all hypothetical.
Well, and I will tell you, to answer that one directly, we don't start a whole lot of programs until we get sign-off from the end user when it comes to touch panel. Yes, there's going to be changes, yes, there's going to be adjustments, but at least for our clients, that's one thing that they understand going in, is there's going to be a process, and that process involves somebody somewhere, and not you, Mr. Integrator, but somebody at the either a owner representative or the owner themselves signing off and saying, and I'm not talking about an actual document, but an email saying, yes, this is what I'd like to see in the touch panel, or no, can you do this and this and this, So that's at least how we do it. So, all right, as we kind of wrap up here, Bernard, let's get you guys and kind of everybody on this. What are some of the things that programmers can do to kind of minimize some of these things that just kind of keep cropping up, or maybe lingers on and doesn't let a system be completely finished?
I think it's documentation and communication. I think, one thing that I personally do when I go to a project is that I bring a notepad, because inevitably, once you turn on the TV, once you pass the video, everybody's going to come, oh, I would like to see, and just start running this tab of having the notepad up there and just having people write down what their requests are and then just pass it through the chain. I think, what happens is on the control system side of things, we get to that last 90-95%, but on the programming side of things, that last 10% is most of our time. And what happens is in the process of doing that last 10%, people are so excited with the system that they start asking for additional features that may or may not be part of the system. So I think capturing that and keeping the documentation, communication, and just keep on passing it through channels would eventually, get everybody to the finish line and preserve timelines.
Yeah, absolutely. Goldie, from your standpoint, what are some of the things that we can do to kind of make sure that, as Bernard said, scope creep is kind of the killer of that last 5-10%? How do we eliminate some of that?
I always try to go, if possible, and again, coming from a different standpoint than you guys are, I try to go right through. I ask the project manager, can I contact the customer directly and talk to them? And when like Jim said, the customer is not always the end user, but I try to pose all these questions to him and say, are you sure? Are you sure? And then maybe put it in an email. Here's what we discussed today on that phone call, and here's what the plan is. If there are any changes, let me know. I try to get directly to the end user if possible. I know that's difficult, especially from your guys' standpoint. I don't envy you guys at all. I mean, I envy your bank accounts, but I don't envy. I don't. But I don't envy, the position of where you guys are at. It's got to be rough,
But it's fun. That's what makes it fun. Is the calls at 6 o'clock in the morning? Anyway.
Right.
All right, Mr. Greenblatt. Let's kick this off and let's wrap this up here. System's done, right? Program is done. There's sign off. There's 100%. Everybody's happy, joy. What do we do to make sure that it's maintained? What do we do as programmers to make sure that the system is completely supported going forward?
I think it's important that there's an open line of communications. I think that having remote access is key, because that gives you your biggest ease of response and the ability to diagnose or troubleshoot or do updates, whatever that might be. So hopefully the system is well tested enough so that the items that are reported are either an obscure situation that may not have been thought of, or they may be user preferences, and that's fine. And most systems have that. And I think that if a customer is contacting you with additional requests, that means that they like what they have and that they're using it. And so having that relationship to be able to either build it in up front and say, I have time allotted for you to get one more update after a certain amount of time. That's one way of doing it, or providing some type of a maintenance agreement so that there's the ability for whether it's the integrator or the end user, whomever that might be, to contact the programmer and say, I have this running list of requests from my users, and I'd like to talk to you about how we can resolve them. But I think the key is customer service, being responsive, and having some type of a tool in place so that a customer can feel comfortable reaching out. I think one more thing I wanted to add, that talking to what Bernard said, I think one thing that gets a little overlooked these days is a good punch list, and I think that's real important to be able to have. When you're closing out a project, a running list of what needs to be done and whose responsibility it is. I just want to throw that in too.
All right, that makes sense. Jim, your standpoint, how do we support this going forward once the system's done?
Yeah, I really like Steve's idea of having a maintenance visit or one more round of updates sometime after it's closed. And I would also work into that maintenance visit training, because it's so important. Not only and not just training where you kill them by PowerPoint, but death by PowerPoint, but it's criteria based. So you tell them what the system is supposed to do, and then you have everyone at the training physically do it, so that there is no question. Number one, that the system works perfectly, and number two, that you have trained, maybe certified users of that system. And so you have a list of it, the client gets a list of it, and then there's no more questions. Everyone there knows that it works, and if they have comments, if they have little tweaks and stuff like that, you take care of it there.
Real quickly to that point, who is involved in that training? Because you said make sure everybody there has touched it. Who there then is at that training?
For us, it's definitely the actual people who are going to be using it. They're kind of the most important. But the more we can get the people signing the checks, our clients, there to see what we do, to see what we delivered, it just makes the whole getting paid process that much easier.
All right, very good. Goldie, from your guys' standpoint, what do you do to support this thing going forward?
Well, obviously, since we're the integrator, we're hoping they call us back. We're hoping we're working on the next project with them anyway, and they say, hey, by the way, can you make these changes to blah 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 last project? And yeah, generally, as long as they're not asking for anything huge, we're trying to always keep them happy, so they want to come back for more. But Steve mentioned remote access. We love remote access, and I understand it as much as you guys do, but probably 80% of our clients won't let that happen very easily. And they're a financial institution, and their financial security is much more important than the convenience of our being able to get over there and solve their problem quickly. Although I'd love it and I push it all the time, it rarely seems to happen for me. But from my standpoint as an integrator, what I would ask from contractors is that when you guys are done, that you send us the latest code and we have it on our system, because I can't tell you how much time I've spent trying to, making changes to a job. And this is 3 years down the road, by the way. Making changes to a job, and then we load it in, and stuff doesn't work. And this had nothing to do with that other thing that you just broke. And, it was because we didn't have the very latest source code. It was maybe a rev or two older, and hopefully we still have a good relationship with that contractor, and we can call them and say, and the guys that we do have those kind of relationships with, they're the guys that we're using over and over again anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Bernard, last word on this. How do we maintain these systems going forward?
I think the key to that is to start the conversation before the project finishes. I think the conversation should start when you send the first round of touch panel submittals, because I think the two most important things in these systems are first-time adoption. And if the first-time adoption is low, the first-time use is poor, the adoption is going to go down. So I think having a conversation early on in the process to say, look, this is going to be something that's widely used. Let's talk about maintenance and training. And I think those two are the biggest things. I think training is number one and maintenance is number two. Because I would say 80 to 90% of the problems usually come from training. Either they're doing it a way that no one thought of doing it, or it's a way that they didn't know how to do it. So I think that's the majority of things that happen, and that 10% usually happens when the CEO is trying to do his meeting. So I think having the communication about training and maintenance well in advance of turning the system over before it's, hey, we just need to get done, makes that more successful.
All right, very good, guys. That'll do it for this month. Thanks so much for joining us, Mr. Jim Maltese from AVR. Thank you, sir.
Thank you all. It was a blast.
And how do people get a hold of you?
At Jimmy Maltese on Twitter, or that's the best one.
That'll work. All right. Twitter's good. Mr. Dave Goldberg, Goldie from Advanced AV. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And how do people get a hold of you?
Goldie at advancedav.com.
Goldie at Advanced AV. That's pretty simple.
Wow, he even has a personalized email.
Well, he's Goldie. What do you expect?
You can even spell it wrong. You can spell it G-O-L-G-I-E, G-O-L-G-Y. All those aliases are all taken care of.
Wow.
You must know somebody in the IT department.
Well, due to various failings in the past 17, 18 years, it had to happen.
Understand. My buddy Bernard, Bernard, good Lord, Bernard, Bernard Morgan. Thank you, sir.
Had a blast, guys. It was fun.
And how do people get a hold of you?
Either hit us on our website at www.icsplusonline.com or drop me an email at bmorgan@icsplusonline.com.
All right, very good. And last but not least, Mr. Steve Greenblatt. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Glad to be here. You can reach me company website, controlconcepts.net, and social media at Steve Greenblatt, a bunch of different ways, and doing a little bit of writing for SCN and Commercial Integrator, and check them out and send me a note.
All you have to do if you want to get in touch with Steve is open your eyes. He's everywhere.
He is everywhere. He's like, Santa Claus or something. All right, my name is Tim Albright. Don't follow me, but go by the website if you would, please. Lots of folks put a lot of hours in the news site. So avnation.tv. avnation.tv, you'll find this program and a host of others. We have a brand new EdTech coming out sometime this week. And our weekly show, AV Week. This week on AV Week, we have a non-U.S. version, I guess is the best way to put that. I have a couple Europeans, actually a guy that used to work for Mr. Greenblatt. So we'll be talking to Germany and the UK this week on AV Week. So check it out if you would, please. avnation.tv, avnation.tv. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much for watching. This has been A State of Control.